Today, we want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible. We never again want to see Hamas carry out the appalling terrorist attacks that Israel was subject to. And we know that just calling for an immediate ceasefire now, which collapses back into fighting within days or weeks, is not in anyone's interests. We will be reiterating the government's position via a written ministerial statement. I fear that this most grave matter that we are discussing today and this afternoon has become a political row within the Labour Party, and that regrettably,
I want to hear the point of order.
thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that regrettably, Mr. Speaker has inserted himself into that row and undermined the confidence of this House in being able to rely on its long-established standing orders to govern its debates. Long-established conventions that should not be impaired by the current view of a weak leader of the opposition and a divided party. I would ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would ask that the Speaker take the opportunity to reassure all honourable and right honourable members that their Speaker, our Speaker, will not seek to undermine those rights in order to protect the interests of particular members. And that future Opposition Day debates will not be hijacked in this way. And I say this, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the benefit of all members.
Order. I will take...
This is just absolute nonsense. Complete and absolute nonsense. People have lost their homes. Millions of people have been displaced. This has gone on 5 months now. It's obvious they're stealing their land. People are now starving. They won't even let aid get through. Food. You know? People are dying, they're killing children, and they say they have the right to defend themselves, and they're killing families and children, and this has been going on for months, and they're just talking about it. They're still talking about it. And here you hear them making it about themselves, sneering and jeering at each other, you know, tit for tat. Scoring points off of each other. It's just stupid. It's just ridiculous. I mean, people are literally, as soon as the trucks come in, people are jumping on these trucks and pulling the food off the trucks. People are scooping up flour that's from on the floor. The disease is setting in. And you hear these guys. Like it's banter in the pub or something. Like it's like in secondary school where somebody would say something and you'd be like, oh my God, oh. These are our world leaders. This is politics. This is how they sort out world issues. Anyway, let's get on with this book. Unbelievable. It's just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I've totally had enough. Chapter 19, Tribulation Force. 15 tribal members crowded into the lounge room of the main teaching house in Sao Paulo. Furniture had been removed to make space for them, and for the largest legless table, and for the large legless tabletop that lay on the floor in the middle of the room. It had strong leather straps attached to it at either side. Lewis had arrived back from Rio that same morning. In Rio, he had watched a proper doctor. Do this only twice. Before, he had been given the task of operation on his own. Now, less than 2 weeks later, he was to teach others how to do it. There was a long waiting list in Sao Paulo as more and more people There was a long waiting list in Sao Paulo as more and more people were cracking the email code and begging for help to escape the mark. You have two choices, Lewis had said to his first patient earlier that day. While 10 others had listened to the same speech, they had all been brought there blindfolded. We could take the skin off the back, or we can take the whole hand. We're 90% certain of getting the transponder by taking the skin, but it could have worked its way down under the ligaments too. No, please, amigo, take it all off, pleaded the patient, a poor farmer in his 40s named Joaquin. The demons are everywhere, he continued. I cannot sleep. I cannot think. Please take it all off. God help me. His eyes looked heavenward. Now Joaquin was being strapped to the contraption on the floor, like a prisoner on a cross. The front door opened a crack, and Francisco peeked in. I got him, he said. As he entered the room and closed the door behind him, he pulled a fistful of Stanley knives out of his sleeve. He had to steal them. May God forgive me. His head dropped in posture in repentance. I think that under the circumstances God will understand, Lewis said comfortingly. Fran raised his head and let a little grin escape. I'm glad you see it that way, Lewis, he said. 'Cause I don't feel guilty. I didn't feel guilty at all when I took it. Felt kind of good, actually. The others smiled on slightly. The scene was far too tense for anything far more frivolous than that. Joaquin, who had been given a handful of painkillers to swallow 10 minutes earlier, was firmly strapped in. 2 men kneeled on the floor, straddling his legs. 2 men moved closer to his head. They too were on their knees, but they were holding Bibles. They would take it in turns reading Psalms in Spanish while Lewis performed the operation. When they were ready to start, a heavy piece of leather was placed in Joaquin's mouth so that he could bite down. It was important that they not arouse suspicions of the neighbours, and because of that, Joaquin could not afford the luxury of screaming out his pain. A ball of rags were placed in his hand, and he was instructed to hold. A ball of rags was placed in his right hand, which he was instructed to hold as still as possible throughout the operation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Felicidad began to speak in Spanish. He continued to read softly as Joaquin focused intently on other words. The first razor blade knife had been cleansed with alcohol. Lewis applied a rough tourniquet, gripped Joaquin's lower arm to steady it, and then made his first cut across the unturned palm. Using the extendable razor blade, Joaquin's body tensed and he bit hard on the leather. You should just get a machete or just an axe. Just one clean swoop, like all this severing with like a razor blade and a Stanley knife. Whoa. Yeah. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Felicidad continued. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. Psalms 35 or 36, one of them maybe. Can't remember off the top of my head. We need to allow for extra skin from the palm, Lewis explained as he grabbed a needle and thread to tie off an artery. When we finish, we will fold that skin over the stump and join it to the upper portion. Because he had no proper surgical clamps which would grasp the end of a loose artery. That's where you burn it, like you cauterize the wound. Lewis tied most of them off right through the skin. A short distance back from where he had made the cut, he used a simple pair of pliers to hold the skin if necessary. Deeper arteries needed to be cauterized with a hot piece of wire. A particularly painful procedure, the tourniquet had reduced bleeding to a trickle, so that it was not easy to determine whether either the thread or the hot wire had done their job. Lewis had a chart in front of him showing where to look for major arteries. Very tight bandaging should take care of the smaller vessels, he said. Joaquin's eyes were filled with tears, and the knuckles on his left hand were white from squeezing the rags. His whole body struggled in an effort not to move his right hand. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning, Maria read, while Felicidad looked for another suitable psalm. Lewis made a sudden forcible movement with the razor, and Joaquin's body lifted off the table. The two men struggled to hold him still. He whimpered quietly, and beads of perspiration ran down the sides of his head. There, we've cut through most of the nerves. The instructor was saying to his startled students, "The hardest part is over now, Joaquin," he said softly to his patient. Lewis spoke less now, as he fully busied himself with what he was doing. His wide-eyed students crowded closer to watch. So he's teaching like another group of believers to start cutting people's hands off. He was showed twice, now he's showing them, and then they're going to have to practice, and then they go off to their various regions to start doing this in their regions. It was Felicidad's turn to read when the operation was nearing completion. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man unto whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. She read. Joaquin arched his neck back to look directly at Felicidad. Tears ran down his face, as much in response to the words he was hearing as in response to the pain he was feeling. All that was left now were some ligaments joining the bones of the wrist together. Lewis pushed hard with the Stanley knife to cut through the largest of the ligaments while missing the bones on either end of it. Joaquin's eyes closed and he went limp. He had mercifully passed out. When the procedure was finished and Joaquin's stitched up stump was wrapped and bandaged, Lewis reminded his audience that he would do only one more demonstration before they would have to perform the same operation on their own. They would each be expected to do one patient before the day had finished, and they would be doing many more in the days ahead. He finished up with basic instructions on how to nurse the patient in the days after operation. The whole ordeal had emotionally drained all those involved. But even before the wound had begun to heal, when Joaquin was conscious once again, he smiled through his pain. His whole countenance had changed, and he glowed as he spoke of the peace he felt. Lewis warned him that there still could be complications. Infections were commonplace, and without antibiotics, a few people had already died from infections. "This is not a problem," Joaquin said. "I am happy to die for my God. My heart, it is free. Thank you, God. You know, brother, I am happy. I die for Jesus now. Really happy." And Joaquin was not exceptional amongst those who came to have the mark removed. All over the world, a revolution of faith was taking place. People who had never taken seriously the demands of God were discovering peace, joy, love, and courage in the face of death as they exercised obedience to this one command of Jesus. It had become the new rite of initiation into the ranks of the redeemed, a baptism into Christ's suffering. It represented a true circumcision of the heart as they turned from the lie of the false grace to genuine faith in Jesus Christ and all that he taught. Unfortunately, this amputation of the mark was only the start of the suffering for these people. Their missing hand became an inescapable testimony to the rest of the world of their stand against the mark. Everywhere they went, people turned and stared, not because they were different, but because the public was seeing more and more people with missing hands. Something was happening, and the most forward members of the public would stop the amputees and ask, "How did you lose your hand? I have seen others like you. What does it mean?" And from that, the message was being preached by word of mouth to any who had not yet visited the website. Those who heard the testimonies of the amputees would pass it on as faithfully as they received it. For there were none who were untouched by what they had heard. It was necessary to hide the amputees during their initial period of recovery. They were given as much teaching as possible during that period, and then they would be put in touch with other amputees in a separate location. They would be smuggled out of the safe house blindfolded, under cover of darkness, to where they would begin their existence in exile, living like outcasts in the fringes of society. They knew that it would be only a matter of time before their obvious deformity would make them targets for arrest. But they had made their choice, and they all, like Joaquin, were happy to die, if necessary, for their newfound faith. Because the mark was invisible, the 144,000 of the 12 tribes looked no different to everyone else as they walked in the streets. But because of this, they were able to stay anonymous throughout the final 3.5 years. But the amputees became the public image of the movement. They came to be referred to amongst the believers as the Tribulation Force. What Rayford and James' two-dimensional testimony on the internet could not do, despite the powerful truths contained in it, a living testimony from the Tribulation Force made up for. These people who had made such a sacrifice and still boasted of the riches that they had received in return, as though their salvation had cost them nothing, were a powerful testimony to the true grace of God. The Tribulation Force had no promise of refuge in the wilderness, as did the 144,000. They believed that as spiritual lepers, their days were numbered. It would not be long before Dang Chow and his troops would round them up for execution, if Rayford and James' understanding of prophecy was correct. But knowing this only caused them to be more bold in preaching the good news of Jesus. They wanted to help others to escape from the curse that hung over the planet. And their positive, glowing testimony was something the 12 tribes could not match. Thousands more were coming every day to join their ranks. The world was receiving, through this movement, a wake-up call to what it means to have real faith in the midst of a godless generation. At the same time, there was a transformation of a different sort taking place in the halls of power in Jerusalem. Pope Pius, who had vowed to do something heroic someday, was moving further and further away from the likelihood of such a move. He, who had convinced himself that it was not possible to take a stand against the Antichrist because it would have threatened his position, his organization, his reputation, and his comfort. Had been shamed and angered by the testimony of the single-handed members of the Tribulation Force, whom he mistakenly assumed to be the hated 12 tribes. You see, your strength, family and friends, your strength in doing this makes people hate you. They hate your strength. They hate your faith. They hate your strength. They come against you. They speak against you. They want to take your faith away. They want you backsliding because they're not strong enough to do themselves or brave enough. Or they just hate it. They just love their sin. Pius was able to forget about the real sins of Dang Chao by concentrating on the perceived excess of this group of fanatics and the pain and suffering that he believed they were causing all over the world. His mission, see now the lies, like the lies settle in and twisting the story, like his mission with Dang Chao to track down the 12 tribes became more and more of an obsession until he had convinced himself that his true calling in life was to protect the world from such abuse of religion. Living and working so close to Dang Chao had the same effect on Pius as living next to a sewage treatment plant has on local residents. What shocks the senses of visitors ceases to be noticed at all by those who live around it day after day. Dang Chao had his vices, it was true, but he was trying to bring stability to the world at a very difficult time. The stresses of his office had probably led him to act in the way that he did. The important thing, Pius told himself, as he cauterized his conscience, was to maintain the unity of the church and the unity of government. A few compromises along the way were unavoidable. They were part of the price he would have to pay for the times in which he lived. Making excuses now, making it seem not so bad. Oh, he's under stress. Oh, but look at what he's done. And just no. Excuses not to make a stand. Excuses not to fight. Excuses not to speak up. Not to walk away. You see it all today with church leaders. Just excuses, 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 excuses. Oh, it's nothing. Oh, don't worry. Concentrate on this. Just concentrate on the gospel. Concentrate on love. Pius was talked into making secret alterations to the statue in front of the basilica. A speaker was installed, as well as a series of guns around the base of the statue. Great crowds gathered in the forecourt each day, and the giant image would speak to the crowds at random intervals, saying, "Bow down and worship your king and your God." 5 seconds after the announcement, the guns, which were placed about a meter above the ground, would fire. Scores of people were killed and injured the first time that the guns went off. There had been no warning about what to expect, and Deng Chao had chuckled at how effective the carnage was in getting people to fall flat on their faces and lie there until they were sure the guns had stopped. The next time that the image spoke. There will always be collateral damage in military matters, he said, when people complained about the innocent spectators being killed. Spectators who would have gladly bowed down if they had known what was expected of them. Isn't it interesting how quickly word is getting around to other innocents, he giggled. Now that we have made examples of a few weaklings who would hide behind their ignorance. The Antichrist had no qualms about killing a few of his own faithful in order to make a point. Don't we know that about governments and world leaders? They have no problems killing their own people to get their own way, to force a narrative. We've seen it many, many times. I don't need to mention it. The most recent one we've seen at the end of the first week of October. But what he desired most was to rid the world of the terrible 12 tribes who were gaining a higher profile every day with their prophecies against him. News of the amputations had reached him, and he decreed that guillotines should be constructed in malls and shopping centres all over the world. If believers were executed publicly in great numbers, he reasoned, it would successfully terrorize any of his followers who might be considering defection. End of chapter. Zion Ben Jonah writes, powerful faith affects all with whom it comes into contact. Some will be inspired to imitate what they see, but most only became angry when they see such faith. They cannot live with the truth about their own spiritual poverty, and so they attack those who have shamed them. They call them heretics, fanatics, cults, and they seek to have them silenced, if not destroyed. Oh, man. This guy comes up with just some gems, mate. He just, he just lays it down like just raw facts. The Revelation talks of a great multitude which could not be numbered, in addition to the 144,000 saints who are sealed by God before the Great Tribulation begins. It says that these people will wear white robes when they stand before God, robes with which have been clean in the blood of the Lamb. Every time I get on this camera, I just can't speak. Revelation 7:9, 14:7, and 14:17. The blood of the Lamb symbolizes the blood that Jesus spilled for all of us when he was crucified. But Jesus also asked us to take up our own crosses and to follow in his footsteps. The Revelation says that during the Great Tribulation, believers will be able to spiritually triumph over the Antichrist by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony and by the fact that they loved not their lives, even in the face of death. Revelations 12:11. All indications are that the great multitude that comes out of the Great Tribulation will actually be martyrs following the Lamb to their deaths. The Revelation specifically says of them that they will be beheaded. Revelation 20:4. Family and friends, are you ready for that? See, that's when the real test begins. That's why we're telling you now, because, you know, we might be gone by then. We might be gone, hopefully. Yah willing, we might be gone by then. And it's this, what I'm reading here is a test left for everybody else. Okay, you lived your life ignoring the Most High, ignoring Christ. What are you going to do now? Now it's all unraveled. Now it's unmistakable. Now it's right before your eyes. It's undeniable. What are you going to do now? Are you going to conform? Are you going to run away and put your head in the sand? Or are you going to stand now? Are you going to stand? Do you want to be saved? Do you want the kingdom? Do you want the second life? Do you want to survive? No matter if you are a servant in the kingdom, you are one of the least in the kingdom. It's nothing compared to the final death, the second death, the lake of fire. What is your choice? What are you going to do? Are you going to dig your heels in? Are you still going to have cognitive dissonance? And this is why I say I pray for strength, because the good book says that a spirit will be put over people so that they won't see, so that they won't have the ability to do this. They're going to be stubborn. They're going to harden their hearts like Pharaoh. And their anger's going to turn towards God. Because that's the reality, family and friends, which we all have to get used to. One day we may die for this. People have died for this over the centuries. People are dying for this even today. Isaiah 57, 1 and 2. The righteous man dies. The righteous man is taken, even through evil, so that he is spared the tribulations. That's mercy. Death by nukes. That's mercy. So what once again, like, just last thing I want to say to those of you, us in the West, those of you in the West, you know, God judges whole nations. And your leaders are dragging you down. They're dragging you with them. This is why you need to know, like, this is why we're telling you, because these priests and pastors ain't telling you. Your whole nation will be judged because of what your kings and your priests are doing or not doing. They lie, they steal, they kill, they destroy. So please go to Revelations 13:10, because the question I'm asking you, because it also is another sign of who the children of Israel really are, and who is about to be judged, what's about to happen. What you cannot run from. And why are we telling you now? Revelations 13:10. I ask all you Caucasian believers, what is the patience of the saints? And that little verse, Revelations 13:10, tells you so much. so much. Because we're waiting for you to prove to us that you are not the people from John 8:44. This is what we're waiting for. We're waiting for you to prove that you're not the people from John 8:44. And so far, crickets. Tumbleweed.